I want to tell you a story about the promises we inherit, the ones written not just on paper, but in the soil beneath our feet and the blood in our veins. It's a story about how the deepest winter of the soul can be the very thing that prepares us for the coming of spring. We've all felt it, haven't we? That moment of being cast out, of standing alone against a wind that feels strong enough to strip the flesh from our bones. We've all faced a giant of our own making, a shadow that tells us we are small and worthless. This is a story for that moment. It's a story about a scared boy, a righteous woman, and a debt that could only be paid with courage. It asks a question that echoes down through the generations: when everything is lost, when shame is your only companion, can a single promise be enough to bring you back to life? Can the faith of one person be the seed from which a forest of justice grows? Watch closely now, and listen. The truth is often found not in the thunder of a sermon, but in the quiet crackle of a fire built against the cold. The world had shrunk to the smell of wet ash and the icy grip of November mud. Finn stood before the skeletal remains of his family's barn, a structure that had held the scent of 100 seasons of hay and hard work. Now, it was a black, jagged mouth open to a scornful grey sky. He was 17, but the shame that clung to him was ancient, a heavy coat soaked in the town's whispers and Judge Thorne's pronouncements. Negligence, the judge had declared, his voice smooth as polished river stone and just as cold. A tragedy born of youthful carelessness, but Finn knew it was a lie. The debt his father had carried, a weight that had stooped his shoulders and silenced his laughter long before it put him in the ground, was the real fire. This ruin was just the smoke. His hands, shoved deep in his pockets, were trembling. Not from the cold, but from the utter hollowness inside him, the terrifying certainty that he was the last of his line, and he was failing. The land, his birthright, felt alien under his worn boots, ready to shrug him off like a dead leaf. That's when he felt a presence behind him. He didn't hear footsteps, just a sudden shift in the air, the way the world quiets when a hawk passes overhead. He turned. She was tall, impossibly so, framed against the sullen pines of the high ridge. Her face was a landscape of its own, carved by sun and wind, with eyes the color of a winter creek. She was Silas, the woman from the mountains, a figure of myth in the valley below. Some said she was half wild, that she spoke to wolves. All Finn knew was that her gaze held no pity, only a startling, unnerving assessment. She took a slow step forward, her worn leather duster barely stirring. "They say you let a lantern burn too high," she said, her voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. Finn's throat was tight. He could only nod, the lie tasting like bile. She looked from his face to the charred timbers, then back again. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the drip of water from a scorched beam. Then she spoke the words that would change everything. "Judge Thorne is a patient thief," she stated, not as an opinion, but as a law of nature. "He stole my father's water, and he's using your father's ghost to steal your land." The fire was his signature. She held out a hand, not in comfort, but in command. It was a large, calloused hand, strong and steady. "Come with me. Stay the winter. By spring, you will be the son your father wanted you to be, and this land will answer to your name again. I give you my word." The climb into the high country was a silent, punishing ascent. Silas moved with an economy of motion that left Finn breathless, his town-soft muscles screaming in protest. The air grew thin and sharp, scouring his lungs, and with every upward step, the valley of his failure shrank below. He followed her not out of hope, but out of the absence of any other choice. He was a stray dog following the first hand that didn't raise a stone against him. Her cabin was tucked into a fold of the mountain, almost invisible, built of stout pine and chinked with mud and moss. It was more fortress than home, a testament to solitude. Inside, a fire was already laid in the stone hearth, waiting for a match. The space was sparse, smelling of pine smoke, dried herbs, and oiled steel. A long rifle rested on pegs over the mantelpiece, its stock worn smooth with use. There was one cot, one table, 2 chairs. In that first week, they barely spoke. She moved about her tasks with a rhythmic intensity, splitting wood, checking her snares, mending a leather strap. Her silence was not empty, it was watchful, a test. She gave him chores that were simple but essential. Hauling water. Stacking firewood. He did them numbly at first, his mind still trapped in the smoking ruin of the barn. He expected questions, accusations, or worse, the suffocating balm of sympathy. He received none of it. She treated his presence as a fact, like the coming snow or the setting sun. One evening, as a blizzard began to howl outside, sealing them in their mountain keep, she placed a block of pine and a small, sharp knife on the table in front of him. "Your hands are shaking," she said, her back to him as she stirred a pot over the fire. "Your mind is loud. Make your hands quiet your mind." Finn stared at the wood. It was a simple, worthless thing. He picked it up, feeling the grain. His first cuts were clumsy, gouging the soft pine. He wanted to throw it into the fire. But he looked at Silas's straight, unyielding back, and something held him fast. He took a breath, the first one that felt like it reached the bottom of his lungs, and made another, slower cut. The knife bit into the wood, and for a fleeting second, he thought of nothing else. He was just a boy, with a piece of wood and a knife, sheltered from a storm that raged both outside and in. The winter had begun. The days bled into one another, marked not by a calendar but by the deepening of the snow and the slow, steady work of their hands. Finn's world contracted to the four walls of the cabin and the silent, white wilderness that surrounded it. Under Silas's spare instruction, he learned the language of the mountain. He learned to read the meaning of a broken twig, to tell a wolf track from a coyote's, to know by the ache in his joints that a storm was gathering. He learned to shoot the long rifle, not with anger, but with a stillness that was harder to master than the recoil. "A gun is a promise," Silas told him one afternoon, her voice barely a whisper in the vast silence of the snow-covered forest. "You aim at what you mean to hit." Nothing else. Her lessons were never gentle. When he fumbled a knot while setting a snare, she simply undid it and waited for him to try again, her patience a formidable, silent wall he had to climb. Yet, there were moments of unexpected grace. He would wake in the deep, cold dark to see her by the firelight, meticulously cleaning the rifle, her movements as reverent as a prayer. Or he would find her carving, her large hand surprisingly deft as she coaxed a tiny, perfect fawn from a piece of scrapwood. She never gave them to him, just set them on the mantelpiece, a small, silent herd growing beside the stacked tins of beans and flour. One night, a fever took him, a deep, rattling sickness that left him shivering and weak on his cot. He drifted in a haze of disjointed nightmares, the fire, the judge's smiling face, his father's coffin. Through it all, he was vaguely aware of Silas. He felt a cool cloth on his forehead, tasted the bitter tea she pressed to his lips, heard her low, rough voice murmuring things that were not quite words, more like the soothing rumble of the earth itself. When the fever broke, he woke to find the dawnlight slanting through the cabin's single window. A new carving sat on the small table beside his cot, a wolf, its head lifted as if to howl. It was fierce and lonely and beautiful. He reached out a trembling hand and touched it. For the first time since the fire, he did not feel ashamed of his own weakness. He felt only a profound, aching gratitude. He looked over at Silas, who was watching him from her chair by the hearth, her face unreadable in the morning shadows. He didn't need to speak. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod and turned back to the fire. As the winter deepened, so too did Finn's understanding. The fear that had lived in his belly for months began to slowly recede, replaced by a quiet, hardening resolve. He saw it in his own hands, no longer soft and uncertain, but calloused and capable. He felt it in the steady rhythm of his heart as he tracked a deer through the deep snow. He was being reforged in the crucible of this mountain silence. The true lessons began one evening in January, when the wind outside shrieked like a banshee. Silas finally took down the worn, leather-bound book that Finn had seen her studying so many nights. It was not a Bible, as he had once thought. She laid it on the table between them, its cover cracked and ancient. "This was my father's," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "And his father's before him." She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with elegant, looping script, but it wasn't just a ledger. There were maps, hand-drawn with painstaking detail, showing every creek and spring on the land that stretched from this mountain down into the valley, Finn's land. Our families were the first here, Silas explained, her finger tracing a faint blue line that marked a powerful underground aquifer. Mine on the high ground, yours in the basin. We understood the water was life for us both. This book is a record of that promise. A treaty between us. She then turned a page to reveal a separate, folded document tucked inside. It was Finn's family deed, the original, signed and sealed generations ago. It described the land's boundaries with a clarity that left no room for doubt. It was a sacred text, a testament to the sweat and dreams of his ancestors. Thorn knows about the water, she continued, her eyes locking onto his. It's why he hounded your father, burdened him with false debts until his heart gave out. Your father never sold the land, Finn. He refused. Thorn forged the papers he's using to foreclose. He needs that water to sell to the railroad, and he's willing to erase history to get it. A cold fury, clean and sharp, pierced through Finn's grief. It wasn't just his barn, his inheritance. It was his father's honor. It was Silas's history. It was a crime that stretched back decades. My father, Silas said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a raw edge of old pain surfacing for the first time, questioned Thorn's claim to the water rights upstream. He was found at the bottom of a ravine. They called it an accident. The room was silent, save for the howl of the wind. Finn looked from the book to Silas's face, and he finally understood. This wasn't just a season of survival. It was a season of preparation. A long, cold winter of honing a weapon, not of steel, but of truth. The first signs of the thaw began in late March. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin, a slow, steady metronome counting down the days. The snow receded, exposing the hard, frozen earth. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling, began to stir in Finn's chest. He felt stronger, surer. He and Silas now worked together with an unspoken understanding, a partnership forged in shared silence and purpose. He could anticipate her needs, and she seemed to know the questions in his heart before he could voice them. The plan was simple and terrifying. On the day of the foreclosure hearing in town, Finn would walk into the courthouse and present the original deed and the treaty book. He would challenge Judge Thorn not with accusations, but with undeniable proof of his family's legacy and Thorn's fraud. Silas would be there, a silent witness, her very presence a testament to a history Thorn had tried to bury. Her role was to be the unwavering rock against which the judge's lies would break. He would stand on her strength. He spent the evenings practicing, speaking the words he would say to the judge, his voice shaky at first, then growing firmer. Silas would listen, her expression unchanging, occasionally offering a stark correction. "Don't ask. Tell," she'd say. The truth doesn't beg for an audience. On the morning they were to leave, a week before the hearing, a strange stillness fell over the mountain. The birds were silent. A heavy mist clung to the pines. Silas stood at the window, her body rigid. "They're coming," she said, her voice flat. Finn's blood ran cold. He looked out and saw them, 3 riders, making their way up the barely visible trail, Thorn's men. There was no time. Silas moved with blistering speed. She shoved the leather-bound book and the deed into Finn's hands, pushing him toward a loose floorboard beneath her cot. "Hide this. It is all that matters," she commanded. Then she took the long rifle from the wall. "Go out the back. Run east to the old trapper's line. Follow it down to the valley. Do not stop. Do not look back." Go. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw not a guardian, but a warrior preparing for her last stand. "But you," he started, his voice cracking. "I promised you a spring," she said, a grim, faint smile touching her lips. "Go claim it." She pushed him again, harder this time. He heard the riders dismounting, their rough voices cutting through the mist. He scrambled out the small back opening, the precious documents clutched to his chest, and ran. The first gunshot echoed behind him, a sound that ripped a hole in the world. He obeyed her. He did not look back. Finn ran until his lungs burned and his legs were numb, stumbling through the melting snow and treacherous undergrowth. The sounds of the fight, shouts, the splintering of wood, the sharp crack of the rifle, faded behind him, replaced by the frantic pounding of his own heart. He imagined Silas, standing alone against 3 men, a solitary giant defending a promise. Grief and terror warred within him, a sickening storm that threatened to pull him under. He wanted to turn back, to fight and die with her, but her last command was seared into his mind: go claim it. Her sacrifice would be meaningless if he failed. He hid for 2 days, moving only at dusk and dawn, eating nothing, drinking from the icy streams. The leather-bound book was a heavy, sacred weight against his ribs. He felt her presence in its heft, her voice in its rustling pages. He was no longer just Finn, the shamed son. He was a courier, a keeper of the truth, the last soldier in a war he hadn't known he was fighting. When he finally emerged from the foothills and saw the familiar lights of his town, he did not feel relief. He felt the crushing weight of his solitude. He believed Silas was gone, murdered in her cabin, another victim of Thorne's insatiable greed. The thought of facing the judge alone was terrifying. The boy who had fled into the mountains in November was a ghost. The man who had come down was filled with a cold, hard purpose, but he was hollowed out by loss. On the morning of the hearing, he walked into town. He didn't slink through the alleyways. He walked straight down the middle of the main street, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the courthouse spire. People stopped and stared. He heard the whispers, saw the pointing fingers. He was the disgraced boy, the fool who had lost everything. He ignored them. He was walking for Silas. He clutched the book under his arm, its sharp corners digging into his side, a painful, welcome reminder of his mission. He pushed open the heavy doors of the courthouse. The room was packed. Judge Thorne sat elevated behind his large oak bench, a portrait of civic authority and gravitas. His eyes, small and predatory, found Finn immediately. A flicker of surprise, then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well," Thorne boomed, his voice filling the room. "Look what the winter has thawed. Come to watch the final, legal transfer of your family's folly, boy." The courtroom air was thick with the smug certainty of Thorne's power. Finn's heart hammered against his ribs, but he remembered Silas's words, "The truth doesn't beg." He walked forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, until he stood before the bench. The crowd murmured, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The town preacher, Reverend Michael, sat in the front row, his face a mask of worried sympathy. The school teacher, Mrs. Gable, who had taught Finn his letters, wrung her hands. They were good people, but they were cowed by the judge's influence. "I have not come to watch, Judge Thorne," Finn said, his voice clearer and stronger than he expected. "I have come to correct the record." He placed the leather-bound book on the railing before the bench. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that cut through the whispers. "This is my family's deed. The original. And this," he opened the book to the hand-drawn maps, "is the record of the water rights, a treaty sworn between my ancestors and the first family of the high country." Thorne's smile faltered. He stared at the book, his composure cracking for a fraction of a second before being sealed behind a mask of judicial outrage. "What is this nonsense? Forged documents and fairy tales from a delinquent boy. The matter is settled. The deed is filed. The debt is recorded." He banged his gavel. "Bailiff, remove this young man. He is disrupting official proceedings." The bailiff, a burly man who owed his job to the judge, started forward. Finn stood his ground, his gaze locked on Thorne. The debt was a lie. The fire was arson. "And you murdered Silas's father for this same water 20 years ago." A collective gasp went through the room. The accusation hung in the air, audacious and deadly. Thorne's face went purple with rage. "This is slander. An outrageous fiction. She was a half-mad recluse who died in a tragic fire in her own cabin just last week. Another accident born of carelessness." It seems he leaned forward, his voice dripping with venom. "You have no proof. No witness." At that moment, the great rear doors of the courthouse groaned open. Every head turned. A figure stood silhouetted against the bright morning light. She was tall, wrapped in a scorched blanket, one arm in a crude sling. Her face was bruised and cut, but her eyes were blazing with a cold, righteous fire. It was Silas. Alive. She took a slow, deliberate step into the room, and another, her gaze fixed on the judge. The crowd parted before her as if she were a spectre. A profound silence fell over the courtroom, a silence so deep it felt sacred. Silas walked down the aisle, her limp barely perceptible, her presence filling the space with an authority that dwarfed the judge's robes and gavel. She didn't look at Finn, but he felt her strength flow into him, a dam breaking against the shores of his fear. She stopped beside him, facing Judge Thorne. The judge's face had gone from purple rage to a pasty, sickly white. He looked like a man seeing a ghost he had made himself. A tragic fire, Silas said, her voice a low, gravelly echo of Thorne's own words. It carried to every corner of the room. She slowly raised her good hand. In her palm lay a small, dark object. It was a metal brand, twisted and blackened by heat. Your men are as careless as you are, Judge. They dropped this when they set my home ablaze. She tossed it onto the bench. It clattered next to the gavel, the unmistakable TA of Thorne's cattle brand clearly visible. I believe this is yours. The spell of Thorne's power was broken. It shattered like glass. Reverend Michael stood up, his voice trembling but clear. I remember Silas's father. He told me, a month before he died, that Judge Thorne had threatened him over the aquifer. I dismissed it as a quarrel. May God forgive my cowardice. Then Mrs. Gable stood, her hands no longer wringing, but clenched into fists. And I remember Finn's father, a good man, showing me the original deed years ago. He was so proud. He said it was the family's heart, and he would never part with it. One by one, others began to speak. A farmer whose fence line Thorne had moved. A merchant he had blackmailed. The hushed whispers of years of resentment and fear found their voice, rising into a chorus of accusation. The moral community, awakened by the courage of a boy and the impossible return of a woman, was finally speaking truth to power. Thorne, cornered and exposed, stared at the faces turned against him, the faces of the people he had dominated for so long. There was no escape. The law he had twisted into a weapon had turned back on him, wielded by the very people he had oppressed. Finn looked at Silas, her weary but triumphant profile, and he understood the full meaning of her promise. She hadn't just given him back his land. She had given the town back its soul. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Judge Thorne was removed from his bench, his empire of fear and deceit crumbling into dust under the weight of 2 decades of suppressed truth. The forged documents were exposed, and the rightful ownership of Finn's land was reaffirmed, not as a matter of law, but as a matter of justice. The valley breathed a collective sigh of relief, the air lighter, the future brighter. Finn stood on his porch, the deed not in a book, but in his hand, feeling the solid reality of the paper. He was no longer a boy hiding from shame. He was the guardian of a legacy, a man who had walked through fire and found his footing. The spring had come. The hills were alive with the green blush of new life, and the creek, fed by the aquifer his ancestors had protected, ran full and clear. He was not alone. Silas was there, her arm now healing, sitting in a newly made rocking chair on his porch. She rarely spoke, but her presence was a constant, grounding force. She had refused to return to her ruined cabin, and Finn had insisted she stay. A treaty is a promise between families, he had told her, echoing her own words. Our families, she had simply nodded, a flicker of something warm in her Winter Creek eyes. He had started rebuilding the barn, but this time, he was not alone. Neighbors came, the same ones who had whispered about him just months before. They came with hammers and lumber and sacks of nails, their actions a quiet apology, an offering of community. Reverend Michael worked alongside him, his sermons now filled with tales of courage and standing for the truth. They worked together, raising the new timbers against the blue sky, the sounds of their labor a hymn of restoration. One afternoon, Finn found Silas by the creek, watching the water flow over the smooth stones. He stood beside her, following her gaze. The world was quiet, peaceful. You kept your word, he said softly. She turned to him, and for the first time, he saw her smile. It was not a broad grin, but a small, profound curving of her lips, a crack in her stoic facade that let the light pour through. "A promise is like a seed," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "You just have to be willing to see it through the winter." She looked out at the land, his land, their land. "You are the son your father dreamed of, Finn. You are the spring," and in that moment, he knew he was home. So, you see, a promise kept can be the most powerful force on earth. It can raise a man from the ashes of his own despair, topple a corrupt giant, and heal the heart of a community. It's a reminder that our worth is not determined by the voices that shout us down, but by the quiet convictions we hold in the deepest winter of our lives. We all have a mountain to climb, a truth to carry. We all have a promise to keep, to our ancestors, to our children, to ourselves. It might be a promise to be brave, to speak up, to build something new from the ruins of what was lost. The world will tell you that you are small, that the winter is endless, and that your voice doesn't matter. It will present you with forged deeds and false debts, hoping you will believe a lie and surrender your birthright. But I am here to tell you to look for the Silas in your life, that person, that principle, that inner strength that offers you sanctuary and demands your courage. And if you cannot find one, become one. Hold fast to the truth. Make your hands quiet your mind. Know that even in the deepest snow, the seeds of spring are waiting. They are waiting for the thaw. They are waiting for you. For your promise.